This presentation is going to deal with the first 30 bars of one of your set works. It's called Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, and it was composed by Claude Debussy. The term Impressionism is used to describe this style of composition, and there are clear links with the Impressionist painting movement, which was also taking place in France around the same time, around 1912. Impressionist music can be described as music which uses very vague harmonies and rhythms to evoke a particular mood or atmosphere. This piece is based on a poem which is also called Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune by Stephen Mallarmé, and it tells the story of an afternoon in the life of a faun, where he wonders if he has dreamt about a nymph coming to visit him, or if it actually happened. Not a lot happens in the poem really, it's more about mood. In real terms, Impressionism in music can be broken down into different characteristics. First of all, the composer aims to get rid of any sense of clear pulse in the music. If we look at the beginning of the piece, the time signature is 9/8, which should give us a feeling of 3 in a bar. However, you will notice that Debussy ties notes across the main beats of the bar. So first of all, here in bar 1, we can see that the C sharp is tied across between the first and second beat. And also between bar 3 and 4, you can clearly see that notes are tied across the bar line. He also juxtaposes very different rhythms beside each other, which basically means he puts them beside each other. In the first bar, for example, we can see the use of semiquavers beside triplet semiquavers, beside quavers, and so on. We are only looking at the first bar for now, but later on in the piece you will find tied notes, juxtaposed rhythms, and heavy syncopation in the main melodies right the way through the piece. Another feature of Impressionism is vague harmony. Again, if we look at the beginning of the piece, we can see 4 sharps in most of the parts, and that should imply E major. However, if we look at the opening motif, E major does not feature at all. We don't have any E's. B is there, but it's not really featuring very heavily. So even though it says it's in E major, the music is saying something different. However, if we look at the opening motif, we will see that C sharp and G natural are very important. And that is really because they are the highest and lowest notes in those bars. And we can call those tonal centres. By tonal centres, I mean notes that seem to have more of an importance than others. Usually in a piece of music, this is the tonic. However, in Impressionism, composers try to avoid any sense of stability that tonic may bring. So as I said, our opening motif moves between C sharp and G natural. The interval between these 2 notes is an augmented fourth, or more commonly known as a tritone, which is really one of the most dissonant intervals in music. Tritones feature very heavily in orchestral music of the 20th century, and they are really one of the most dissonant intervals in music. In this motif, we start on a C sharp and descend chromatically, or in semitones, down to a G natural. So from C sharp, well down to B, A sharp A, G sharp G, and so on. In the second half of the bar, we ascend or move back up to the C sharp, not chromatically this time, but in whole tones, so from G to A and A to B. This movement leads us on to another feature of Impressionism, which is the use of scales other than the major and minor. Debussy made a conscious effort to use scales such as chromatic, whole tone, pentatonic, and modes in order to drastically change the colour of his music. It's a bit like an artist finding new colours which he hasn't used before. Debussy was inspired by different examples of world music from other countries, such as the Indonesian gamelan, and how they were based on scales not commonly used by other classical composers. Another feature of Impressionist music is the innovative use of instruments. How was he innovative? Well, he used well-known instruments in new ways. For example, you can see here that the flute plays the opening solo. It isn't unusual for a flute to have a solo in orchestral music, However, it is interesting that he chose to use the lower register of the flute to play it. Ultimately, it creates a sultry and dreamy timbre. Flutes are more well known for typically playing in their higher register, where they sound bright. If we look at the left-hand side of the score, we can see that most of the instruments that he has included in this orchestra, although some don't appear until later on. From the top down, we have 3 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets in A. We can't see them on this page, but we also have 2 bassoons and a cor anglais. So nothing too unusual about this woodwind section for a 20th century orchestra. The brass, however, are limited to only 4 French horns, which is notable as a lot of 20th century orchestral music would use a full brass section with trumpets and trombones, etc. You will notice as well that there is no percussion, which is again quite unusual for 20th century orchestra. However, later on in the score, right at the end, you will find that Debussy has written in a part for antique cymbals, which look like this. This is an unusual choice of instrument, which only a few other composers ever used, for example Berlioz, who was another French composer. And Debussy obviously chose them quite specifically for the sound that they created. Other instruments in this score include 2 harps. Harps feature quite heavily in Impressionist music, as they help to create a certain shimmery, magical mood. And finally, we have our string section, which as usual includes 2 sets of violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. The last feature of Impressionism is the use of non-functional harmony. That is a very important phrase, so I'm going to say it again. Non-functional harmony. Harmony is typically constructed around chord 1, or the tonic. Composers modulate to keys which are associated with chord 1, the piece starts and ends with chord 1, cadences are constructed around chord 1, and so on and so on. So you see, normal harmony is all about the tension that we feel as listeners when we move away from and ultimately return to chord 1. Non-functional harmony, however, takes that tension away, which helps to create the vague, evocative sound that Impressionist composers aim for. In real terms, this means that Impressionist pieces have far fewer cadences than other styles. They also use added note chords, which means that the harmony is rarely based around a simple triad. We don't have too many chords on this page, but if we look at the chord which is played by the clarinets and the oboes, here, we will see an added note chord. The oboes are playing an E and an A sharp. And the clarinets are playing a G sharp and a C sharp. I know it may not look like that, but remember that clarinets in A, or en la, on this score, are transposing instruments, and to figure out what note of the scale they are playing, you need to transpose down a minor third. So, we have a C sharp, an E sharp, and a G sharp. But that's a triad, isn't it? Well, no, not if you include the note from the flute melody on the top line, which is played at the same time. This means we now have a C sharp, an E sharp, and a G sharp as part of the chord, as well as an A sharp in the flute part. A sharp is 6 notes above the lowest note in this chord, which is a C sharp. That means we have an added 6th chord, or a C sharp major added 6th. So, to recap, we have covered the main features of Impressionist music. Firstly, vague rhythms created through tied notes, juxtaposition of rhythms, and syncopation. Secondly, non-functional harmony, including the use of tonal centres, lack of cadences, avoiding the tonic, and added note chords. Thirdly, we noted the use of different types of scales, for example, chromatic, whole tone, pentatonic, and modes. And finally, we looked at the new and innovative way that Debussy writes for certain instruments and creates orchestral scores. This included using unusual registers and carefully choosing instruments such as the harp and the antique cymbals to create a certain timbre or mood. Before you finish this presentation, check that you can answer the following questions. Firstly, can you describe the opening motif in terms of its tonal centres, prominent intervals, as well as how it moves? Secondly, list all the instruments that Debussy uses in this piece without looking at the score, and point out any interesting or unusual ones. Thirdly, outline the idea behind this piece of music. What is it based on? What kind of mood was Debussy trying to create? Who wrote the poem? Finally, give 4 examples of how Impressionist composers created vague and evocative moods in their music, and back it up with points from the score on this first page. This piece of music was often described as the awakening of modern music, as it led on to other styles of 20th century music. The fact that Debussy uses non-functional harmony encouraged later composers in the 20th century to use very little harmony at all, and led to movements such as the serialist movement. Use of instruments in a new way encouraged composers to look further afield in terms of creating different timbres, and we had composers using electricity, prepared pianos, and other instruments in the orchestra. We will now look further into the score. As I mentioned earlier, the piece opens with a solo flute. In bar 4, you can see that we have a chord of C sharp minor with an added sixth of A sharp. At this point, we can also see the beginning of a horn counter melody and some glissandos in the harp. When we look over the page, we can see the rest of the horn counter melody. We can also see that Debussy has instructed the strings to use mutes when we look at this French word, sourdine. What chord are the strings playing? Well, if we look from the bottom stave up, the basses are playing a B flat, the cellos an F and D, and the violas a B flat and A flat. So that is B flat, D, F, which is basically a B flat major triad, as well as an A flat. We call this chord a dominant seventh starting on B flat. It's not a B flat major seventh because B flat major doesn't normally have A flats. It would need to be an A natural. Debussy then uses a whole bar of silence to add to the dreamy and evocative atmosphere. In the next bar, we have a repeat of the horn counter melody, harp glissandi, as well as the B flat major dominant seventh chord. The horns hold the last note of their counter melody and eventually slide upwards to lead to the next section. Take a moment now to listen to these opening 2 pages on your recording. On this page, we can see that the flutes continue to have the opening solo idea which the piece opened with, and nothing has been changed about it. However, what is happening around it though has changed. There are a number of different string techniques being used here. The little lines through the notes indicate a technique called tremolo, where the string player shakes their bow very fast on the string to create a shimmery sound. This technique is often found in Impressionist pieces because it helps to create a really evocative sound. You will also notice the words sur la touche written above the string parts. This instructs the players to move their bows up slightly higher and actually play over the black part of the instrument, which is called the fingerboard. So, in summary, the string techniques that we have here are called tremolo and sur la touche. Tremolo shaking your bow very fast on the string, and sur la touche, meaning to play over the fingerboard. In terms of the harmony here, we can see that it is based around the chord of D. At the beginning of each bar, we have F sharps, but at the end of the bar, we have F naturals. That means that the harmony is moving between D major here and D minor here. The main motif in the flute is taken over by the oboe, who extends it, which basically means they add on a new part. And if we look over the page, we can see that the instruments playing this extension of the main melody quickly build up. So we started off with the oboe extending the melody, but very soon we have added in a second oboe, a clarinet, and eventually first violins, which are divided into two parts. The motif starts to repeat 3 rising notes, which are heard again and again and again, until suddenly just a solo clarinet is playing it. As before, this instrument slides up chromatically to the beginning of the third repeat of the original melody, which we will see over the page. When we look at the melody in the flute here, we can see some changes. The first note, C sharp, is a lot longer than it was originally, and there is an added flourish in the second bar, which wasn't there originally. The harmony here is based around E and B, and if we look at the harmony in the harp chords, we can also see G sharps. So that is E, G sharp, B, as well as C sharps in the harp part and a C sharp in the melody. So again, we have an added 6th chord, E, G sharp, B and C sharp. Note the use of parallel shifting octaves in the lower strings here. Now that we're over the page, we can see that the flute melody has been transposed down a major third. It normally starts on C sharp, but at the minute it is starting on A. Again, the first note has been augmented or made longer, and this time the harmony is based around a B7 chord. Here we have B, here we have F sharp, here we have A and a C sharp, and if we look at the harp part, we have basically B, D sharp, F sharp and C's. So again, another added note chord. Towards the end of the section, you will notice again parallel shifting chords in the strings, as well as chromatic movement in the woodwind and horns. Over the page, we will look at the final appearance of the flute melody in this section. It is back to starting on C sharp, and the first note is still longer. However, this time we see that the chromatic descent, followed by ascending in tones, has been diminished as both flutes quickly move between the C sharp and G natural a number of times. Here the harmony includes B's, D's and F sharps, as well as G naturals. So an added 4th chord again. We can see the strings moving in parallel chords. This time it's an interval of a 7th in the violas and the interval of a 10th or a compound major third in the cello. Over the page, both flutes are playing descending triplet sequences, which is an extension of the original flute melody, and they gradually move down in pitch to the end of this section. The harmony is important here, as coming up we have our first perfect cadence of the whole piece in B major. You can see clearly the movement from F sharp to B in the bass, in other words 5 to 1 or dominant to tonic. However, it is never straightforward with Debussy, and in the second violins you can see a syncopated movement between D sharp and C sharp to create a syncopated suspension which finishes this section.